Welcome to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth, and you're listening to a weekly podcast about books and life. Not necessarily in that order. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show through iTunes, or by plugging our RSS feed into your favorite podcatcher. You can find the RSS feed on our websites, vmspod.com or chimeraobscura.com/vm. We're also on Twitter and Instagram at vmspod, at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com, and on Spotify, YouTube, and tunein.com by searching for Virtual Memories Show. The show might still be on Facebook at facebook.com/Virtual Memories Show, but I deactivated my Facebook account after the Definer stuff came out a few weeks ago, so I have no idea if it's still there. Check up on it and let me know. But anyway, if you like this podcast, please go to the iTunes store, look up the Virtual Memories Show, and leave a rating and maybe a review for us. That'll inspire Apple to promote us a little. And of course, you can also promote us by telling people about the Virtual Memories Show on social media or however else you publicize the things you like. And if that's Facebook, I don't mind. Now, you can support the Virtual Memories Show and get access to exclusive content with a recurring monthly donation via Patreon. Just visit patreon.com/vmspod and set up your level of support. You'll get new material from our patron-only blog, and you'll also get to listen to my quarterly bonus podcast, Fear of a Square Planet, which features extra material from our guests and is only available to supporters of the show. So visit patreon.com/vmspod or paypal.me/vmspod and help me continue to produce smart conversation about books, art, comics, and culture every week at the Virtual Memories Show. Well, I hope Thanksgiving week went well for all my U.S. listeners, and you didn't have to deal with the stereotypical family drama or crazy travel logistics or any of that other stuff. For my part, this is a pretty easy week. I do have to get right back into the swing of things this week with an overnight trip to D.C. to talk about drug shortages in an FDA public meeting on Tuesday, but it's all part of the day job. Also, as far as the third part of my life, given that it's work, the podcast, and something else, I'm going to be running in my first race next weekend. It's just a 5K. It's in Manhattan in Riverside Park. I started running back in July, which I've written about in our weekly email, and I was corresponding with past guest Kyle Cassidy earlier in the week, a photographer and avid runner, about how to deal with single-digit temperatures when running, because late last week we were going to face about 8 or 9 degrees Fahrenheit here in New Jersey. He gave me some advice on what to wear and what to be able to shed as you get warmer. But those emails also kind of edged into why I need to start running in races in order to really figure out how well I'm running and to get better at it. So I bit the bullet and I've registered. So if there is no episode next week, it is definitely because I had a heart attack from anxiety the night before the race and not because of running too hard and going into cardiac arrest on my first 5K. I will say, I did 3 miles Sunday morning, 5K, and demolished the time I'm hoping to hit next week. And these are on some pretty crazy, gnarly hills where I live in Ringwood, New Jersey. I have no idea if I'm going to run faster or slower in the race than I do solo. I'll get back to you about it if this is the sort of thing you have any interest in. But enough about me. Let's talk about Jews and coffee. Now, this week's podcast features a conversation with Shachar Pinsker, a professor of Judaic Studies and Middle East Studies at University of Michigan and author of the new book, A Rich Brew, How Cafes Created Modern Jewish Culture, from NYU Press. When I first saw the listings about this, I was afraid this was like a Tyler Durden moment where it turns out that I've been blacking out from insomnia and basically writing a book that's exactly right up my alley without realizing it was me. But it turns out someone else has some of the same interests as me. A Rich Brew is fascinating. It's about the history of cafes and coffee houses and their impact on Jews as they migrated across Europe and to the U.S. and Israel. That's selling it short. It's broken out in 6 chapters, and they focus on cities and their coffee houses, Jewish migration, and the Jewish artists and writers who kind of came through those cities, and the gestalt of all that. The cities are Odessa, Warsaw, Vienna, Berlin, New York, and Tel Aviv/Jaffa. Shachar does this wonderful job of evoking these various lost eras from the mid-19th century to the mid-20th. And he really gets into the migration of Jews and what they brought with them, what they created culturally in these new cities, how cafe culture isn't a fixed and defined thing, but kind of bends and mutates based on each national and urban culture that it's embedded in. It's really interesting. And he gets at a lot of the writers who came out of those places like Babel and Alechem and people like that. And there are a lot of writers and journalists who were on those various scenes, and some of them even migrate from city to city. So they crop up in multiple chapters, and you sort of contrast the cities sort of by the way these writers, kind of adapted to them at different stages in their lives. It's neat because he likens the cafes to a sort of conceptual Silk Road, or even like a proto-internet where you're connecting various nodes and promulgating ideas and concepts through them. And in a sense, he also kind of reflects the times, especially in the way those cities, nations, and the cafe owners react to the influx of Jews and the idea that Jews have a meeting place outside the synagogue, and what that says about modernity and the secular world. A Rich Brew is a blast, and I'm just really glad Shachar and I were able to get together to talk about it, as well as the work that went into it. We had to plan pretty carefully because he's based in Ann Arbor, and as you guys know, I always do this show in person. So we worked on his travel schedule, and even then, we kind of had to call last-minute audible because it turned out his hotel room proved too small for us to set up the mics and record. Which brings me to caveats. We recorded in a hotel restaurant, so there was background noise, music, and us drinking coffee. There's also an alarm outside early on. Whenever someone opens a door, you can hear this car alarm. But all in all, it turned out to be a pretty good environment for this particular conversation. It's kind of like my first one with Drew Friedman all those years ago, where he insisted we record in the 2nd Avenue Deli, and it's just dishes clattering and yentas and all this noise, but it's absolutely perfect. Or the one I did with his brother, Josh Allen Friedman, who at the last minute insisted we record in the Cafe Edison in Times Square. Sometimes the venue fits the guest. Now here's Shachar's bio. It's from the book. There's a much more extensive version in the show notes for this episode based on his faculty page. Shachar M. Pinsker is Associate Professor of Hebrew Literature and Culture at the University of Michigan. He is the author of Literary Passports, The Making of Modernist Hebrew Fiction in Europe. His new book is A Rich Brew, How Cafes Created Modern Jewish Culture, from NYU Press. And now, the Virtual Memories conversation with Shachar Pinsker. So I apologize that we couldn't find a great coffee house in New York City to record this in, but why don't you tell me about the origin of the book, where it started for you, and what we'll talk about the thesis after, but really where it all began for you with this.
Yeah, okay, so actually the book has more than one point of origin. The kind of the most obvious point of origin was when I was working on my previous book, which is called Literary Passports, The Making of Modernist Hebrew Fiction in Europe. And that book was on modernist Hebrew fiction, on writers in Europe, Jewish writers in Europe who wrote in Hebrew. And it's about how Hebrew modernism was really created, which is kind of strange and almost like a miracle, because Hebrew was not spoken. There wasn't a lot of literary tradition of modern Hebrew literature. Of course, there was a lot of ancient and medieval and religious literature, but modern Hebrew literature was really something that started in the 19th century, and very quickly, at the beginning of the 20th century, there was this kind of leap into modernism, something that we would associate with people like, I don't know, James Joyce, Virginia Woolf, Kafka, but it was done in Hebrew. So that's what the book was about, and it's about the themes and the language and how it all came into being. But one of the questions that started to really interest me, and I wrote part of the book about, was the urban setting, because virtually all these writers, they all came from small shtetls, small towns in Eastern Europe. They received traditional Jewish education, and then they moved to some city, large or small. And I started asking myself, okay, so we know from reading the literature, I'm a literary scholar. Mm-hmm. We know from reading the literature that we can find, by doing textual analysis, all kind of connections between these writers and writers who wrote in Russian and in German and in Yiddish and in many other languages. They were multilingual, but they chose to write in Hebrew. And I wanted to know actually where were they? Where did they meet these people? Was it only by reading other writers, or there was actually a point of meeting and a point? And when I started to ask these kind of questions, I came again and again to the coffee house. Mm-hmm. That was 10 years ago.
Yeah.
And to tell you the truth, at the beginning I thought, okay, and also I should say that even at that point, that it was really just kind of focused on Hebrew, it was already about kind of the multilingualism and the meeting and all that. And I also noticed that in the literature itself, there was quite a lot written about coffee houses, about the cafes as places where activity happened. So anyway, I started noticing that, and then I started to collect materials about coffee houses, and in the beginning I really thought that I'm coming to this space because I love this space so much, because I have personal connection, because I like walking in coffee houses, I like being there in many different places, in Israel where I'm originally from, then in Berkeley where I did my PhD, and anyway, everywhere I go, I like it. So I really thought that it's kind of like this crazy thing that I find it because I like it. But then I realized that no, actually there is something there, and people haven't really discovered it and focused on it. It started with a series of few articles that I wrote actually for Haaretz newspaper in Hebrew, because I was talking to an editor and told him about it, and he said, "Oh, you know what? That sounds like wonderful topic. Why don't you write as many as you want, 4 or 5 articles about each city with some nice photographs and visual? They'll be perfect for a newspaper." And I said, okay, great. Yeah. You know, I've never done something like this, but it was a challenge that I enjoyed. And I really thought that writing these articles, that's it. Yeah. I got it out of my system. I have some use to all these materials that I found, and that's it. But it turned out that it was just the beginning, because people were really interested. I got responses from people, not just in Israel, but from all over the world, who read it in Hebrew, and they said all kind of things. You know, it's so interesting. Are you working on it? And also they gave me information. They started sending me photographs and telling me stories about grandparents and about something that is in the family and all that. And I realized that it's actually a great topic. And then people start to invite me to to conferences. So there was a conference in London about the Viennese cafe, and it kind of opened my eyes that it's a great topic. And then people also told me, okay, so you wrote about these specific cities that you were interested in because of Hebrew, but what about New York? What about other cities? There's so many. And I said, okay, I don't know. What about these other cities? I don't really know anything about cafe culture in New York City. It's like, oh no, there's Cafe Royale, and there's all these places in the Lower East Side. Okay. And then I decided, okay, the combination of all these different things really made me realize that this is a book project. I wouldn't think as a literary scholar that that's going to be a book that I'm going to write on this topic, but it became very clear that people are very interested in it, and it's a great topic that really kind of intersect between literature and history and sociology and
coffee.
And coffee.
Not great coffee, as you point out multiple times, but still coffee.
Yeah.
How did you narrow down to the 6 cities that the book focuses on? Yeah. And is there a second tier of cities that you really wish you could have? I should note for the listener, each chapter is based on it centers around a city's history with cafes and Jews.
Yeah, so it became very clear that the topic is almost endless. I mean, there are many other cities. It was very clear to me that Paris could be a city. I mean, of course, Paris is famous for its cafes, and many people consider Paris the center of modernism and the center of cafe culture. But also Budapest, in the context of modern Jewish culture.
That's the one I was wondering about the most. Having had one trip there, I thought, that would probably fit too. But
right. And people told me, okay, what about Buenos Aires? And because when Jews immigrated there, and there's great cafe culture, and there's a whole world of coffee houses and cafe culture in Middle Eastern cities. I write about Tel Aviv and a little bit about Jerusalem, but there's Baghdad and there's Cairo, and it just became clear that, first of all, it's too big. Second of all, the languages that you need. I'm already working here with Hebrew, Yiddish, German, English, Polish, and Russian, and I needed help with Polish and Russian. Yeah. The other languages I could, and French is not one of my languages, and Hungarian and Arabic. So
Hungarian's its own thing. Yeah. So
yeah. But other people are working on it. I think that there's this. It is this kind of moment that both in the field of Jewish studies and in the field of literary studies and cultural studies and history, there's a lot of interest in this topic that kind of seemed to a lot of people to be kind of on the margins, or something that it's just a space that stuff happened. Yeah. Right?
And you realize it's a recurring thing in city after city, and that it carries through time.
Right. So it's I feel like there's a renaissance now of a lot of scholars from different disciplines and a lot of writers. I mean, there was always interest in coffee and the drink itself and the history of the commodity, and also in the history of the coffee houses as an institution, but it was mostly kind of, people wrote about the British coffee house in the Golden Age, and the Parisian coffee house in the 19th century. There's a very good book, and other than that, there's kind of popular books about, with lots of pictures and all that, which is great. But I feel like now there's a kind of interests that bring together scholars and people who are not scholars, and there's a great conversation there between people from different fields who are interested in that.
Yeah, how do you differentiate, say, the English coffee house model, or the legends that it lives up to, and the sort of coffee houses that you're covering, or that you write about in this book?
Right. So that's
outside of the fact that there were no Jews or is that the biggest thing?
Yeah, actually there were some Jews. I mean, so I talk about it in the book that people really associate the coffee house, think about it as a European institution, but it's not. The origin of the coffee house is in the Near East, is in the Middle East. It was in the Ottoman Empire, and it was in the context of Muslim society, and that's centuries before it even came to London and Oxford. And then when it did come to London and Oxford, it's true that there weren't many Jews, but actually there is kind of a Jewish point there because Jews were very involved in the coffee trade. It was often Sephardi Jews who lived in the Ottoman Empire who brought coffee and the coffee house to Western Europe. And side by side with Armenians and Turks, and so actually one of the first, probably not the first, but one of the first coffee houses in Oxford called the Angels, opened by a Jew named Jacob, probably a Sephardi Jew from Lebanon. But then it developed really within the English context in a very particular way. It was seen as a tavern without wine, as a place without alcohol. That was the new. It was a new commodity. It was exotic. It was exciting. It was also, everybody recognized immediately that it's something that makes you awake and alert.
I was going to say everybody's energetic in there instead of getting more slovenly as they would with booze.
Exactly. Yeah. So sociability, famously in the British context until today, is happening in pubs, right? But coffee houses were these new institutions that came, and it was actually very clear from the very beginning, both in London and Oxford, and then later on, very quickly it moved from there to Vienna and to Venice and to other places. And in the beginning, it was actually very, very clear that it's coming from elsewhere. There was this kind of Oriental element to it. People were dressed up like Turks, and so that made it kind of very different from beer or wine, which are always from the place itself, from the land, from the soil, and coffee was always kind of from elsewhere. But then, of course, it was developed in England very much within this kind of English society, and many people like Jürgen Habermas, who really developed a whole theory, very important one, about the public sphere, sees the English coffee houses as really kind of the beginning of what we would call today, this is oversimplification, but really kind of the beginning of a democratic society within a society that was very much around class and aristocracy and the working class, and then kind of the beginning of a middle class, urban middle class, really developed around the English coffee house. We're talking here about the 17th century, and newspapers and print culture. These all really came into being together. So I talk a little bit about it in the book, because it becomes relevant later on for Berlin and kind of the beginning of Jewish modernity. That there were all these newspapers like the Spectator. There were kind of moral weeklies. They were supposed to put in print form the kind of conversation and the intellectual discussions that happened in coffee houses, and they were also read and sometimes even written in coffee houses. So that was kind of the beginning of what we think of as a European cafe culture. But as I said, it was never just British. It was never just English. It was clear that it's coming from elsewhere.
Yeah, the fact that it was the origins of it, were part of the very nature of how that impacts a culture.
Right, and then very quickly it moved to other cities, including to other cities where there was much more of a Jewish presence than there was in London or Oxford. Places like Venice and Livorno in Italy, which I don't write about. That's earlier on in the 18th century, and then later on to Berlin, to Vienna, to Eastern Europe, and it is in the 19th century. It is kind of interesting that for Habermas, who wrote about the coffee houses, the public sphere, the golden age was really in the 18th century, and then he said there was a decline.
Yeah.
And actually, in the materials that I look at, it was the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century. This was the golden age of cafe culture, and this is really the place where Jews, mostly people who immigrate from other places to these big cities.
Or get forced out.
Or get forced out.
That's our history.
I mean, this is immigration. Migration and immigration are very, very important for this book. It is really a story of Jewish migration. But I think through the lens of the cafe, the story of Jewish migration or immigration, normally people talk about Jewish immigration, about people coming from one place and ending up in the new place. But because I use the coffee houses as what I call kind of a Silk Road of modern Jewish creativity, it is a story about network of migration, and these people, not all of them, but many of them constantly move.
It's one of the funnier parts of the book to me is the several writers who keep showing up in city after city that you had, and that's when he spent 2 years over here and frequented Cafe X and that sense that it was, as you said, a little bit like the internet. There were nodes that people connected to repeatedly, not just a linear progression of this stuff. One of the interesting things to me about the book, or the way you characterize them, is the mutant nature of each one as they move into region after region. As time progresses, the culture in those countries warps, and this happens particularly to me in the final 2 chapters where you're covering New York and Tel Aviv and Jaffa. That it's the local country has a significant effect on how the cafe is interpreted and the role that it plays. Talk about that a little, if you can, in terms of what you saw as the consistent traits of cafe culture, and then what seemed to be national and time specific. Yeah,
so that's one of the really fascinating element in coffee houses, in cafe culture, that on one hand it is a traveling institution. We spoke about the migration of Jews, but the coffee house itself is a traveling institution. It travels from one place to another. On the other hand, it does kind of acquires a very local flavor. And people talk about the Viennese cafe, something that is very particular to Vienna, which is true, and at the same time it's also not so true, because it is moving from one place to another. And then in New York and in Tel Aviv, I mean, each culture has its own pressures and kind of traits that belong to the culture itself. I mean, in Tel Aviv, it's very actually in Tel Aviv it's really interesting, because in Tel Aviv it's kind of going back to the origin, to the Middle East. But the immigrants from Europe, they don't recognize that.
At the same time, it's the influx of German and other immigrant Jews that makes it. Yeah.
They think they bring cafe culture, the cafe house from Berlin or from Warsaw to the Middle East, and they don't realize, or sometimes they see the Arab cafes and this is not coffee house, this is not what it's all about, right? Or in New York, where there is actually very old British, English coffee house culture, but then it almost disappeared by the 19th century. Many people talk about it, that Americans consume coffee at home, but
then the Jews show up and
institution doesn't exist at all. There's taverns and saloons and bars and all that, and that's it. And then the immigrants. I mean, it's not just Jews.
I know, but
it's not just Jews, but
immigration leads to,
and then places like the Lower East Side in New York suddenly become a place that people are amazed. People come and visit, and they go to the Lower East Side, which was always a place of immigration, always a place that was associated with poverty, with vice,
the tenements and the slums.
That's what people thought about, and actually still think about. And then suddenly you have, I mean, my sources, I still find it hard to believe how it was possible, but my sources are talking about something like 250 coffee houses in a tiny area that was full of tenements and so full of poverty, and so it was a lot of it was in basements. So these are very, very different places from Café Central in Vienna, which is luxurious, and these are tiny little places, but the cultural function is essentially the same. So you have people like Henry James and many American intellectuals who come and visit the Lower East Side, and they're amazed to see these people. They don't know how to read them and how to understand them in these kind of places. And it's very interesting to see kind of the outside gaze for the Jews themselves. Many of them still remember coffee houses in Odessa or in Warsaw, in Vienna or in Berlin, but actually many of them didn't, because many of them came to America from small shtetls, and the Lower East Side, that's the first coffee houses that they encounter. Yeah. So, in each and every city there is this very interesting interaction between the local, the national, the culture, the cultural norms, right? I mean, we were talking about New York and about America. People always said, oh, in America everybody's always... even in Yiddish, they used to say it in English, hurry, hurry.
Yeah.
Right? Hurry, hurry. That's American culture. There's no time. There's no time for people to sit in coffee houses like in the Viennese coffee house when people order a cup of coffee and can sit for 5 days, for 5 hours, or the entire day. And in America, it's impossible. But for some of these people, that became possible in those very small places. Sometimes they would walk all day because they were very simple people working as painters and or in factories, and then at night they would spend the whole night in the coffee house. So that's something that is kind of unique to New York. But then you see it again in Tel Aviv. At night, people go to coffee houses. I don't think it's something that you can find very much in European cities where people go to coffee houses at night, at midnight. So there is this kind of interesting element. Also, I mean, the in terms of the food and the drink and the kind of the activities, it all depends on the local culture, you know. So in Warsaw, the coffee house was very much associated or connected with the world of the cabaret. That's not something that you can find in many other places. Maybe a little bit in Berlin, and I mean sometimes people see it happening in one city and move it to another.
But the way it bubbles up from the local culture as opposed to something that's transplanted. That interaction just struck me as fascinating throughout the book. My introduction to a lot of this culture comes from Stefan Zweig, and therefore the Vienna scene. Did you resent Vienna in particular? Just because there's a certain degree of trying to take it down a peg a little in your chapter on it. That I know they got the UNESCO ruling that it's a protected culture, but really cafe culture is pan-European and did you have any resentment particularly, or was it just a matter of trying to keep people from over-romanticizing Vienna as a particular symbol?
I mean, it's not really resentment. I
tend to ascribe that to people.
No, I mean, it's true. I do start the chapter saying that, Vienna really took it as a UNESCO. It's also very, I mean, if there is a resentment, maybe it's the resentment of the fact that people take this kind of culture and try to make it into a museum.
Yeah, becomes
which
a tourist
is something
attraction.
that happens in Vienna, and maybe people in contemporary Vienna that still go to this cafe would think that, would hate what I say and think that it's still a living institution. But my experience of by the way, I made sure that I visit all the places, all the cities that I wrote about, and I went to all the places where coffee houses used to be, and in very, very few cases, maybe one or two, the entire book, places that still exist. And I don't know if you've been to, but Café Central in Vienna, which was very central also in the book and in the chapter on Vienna, still exists, but it's a tourist attraction.
Yeah.
A cup of coffee like this would cost there something like $10, and there's a statue of Peter Altenberg, one of the habitués of the cafe, full size, and you have tons of people go there, they buy a cup of coffee and they take pictures, and that's it. And for me, actually, I remember asking somebody who lives in Vienna, who knows the city very, very well, to take me to places where kind of I can find something of the
more authentic.
You have to go away from the center of the city. You have to go to Leopoldstadt, which is very central in the book because that was the Jewish neighborhood, and there were many coffee houses there as well. And today, maybe things have changed. I've been there already 7-8 years ago, but something tells me that it hasn't changed. There's a lot of Muslim immigration there, and there you find some of these places that still kind of looked very much like in the early 20th century.
Yeah.
So if there is a resentment, there is a resentment of that element of the kind of try to do a museum out of these places, and also I end the book, maybe we'll talk about it later, with this question of kind of what exists now.
Yeah. Oh, I've got that here, trust me.
I'm sure. That's something that everybody's interested in for a good reason. But what I was going to say that there are a couple of places, Café Fanconi in Odessa is one of them, and there are a few others where people recognize that, wait a second, we can take the name of the place and maybe even the location. Sometimes it's in a completely different location, and have this kind of nostalgic space where tourists are going to come and they read about it in Babel and in Sholem Aleichem, and then when they go and visit Odessa, here is Café Fanconi, but it's not in the same place.
Yeah.
and it has nothing to do with so it's very difficult to recreate it, and in a sense there's no point to recreate it as much as I and other people kind of feel nostalgic about it and wanna have access to these places. It's impossible. I mean, listen, the coffee house, after all, is a business. There's actually quite a lot in the book about how there's a tension between it being a business that needs to make money and be profitable, and on the other hand, the cultural function that it fulfills. So, because of this tension, many coffee houses go out of business.
Sure.
Quickly. I mean, it's natural. And then when they go out of business, I mean, Elsa Lasker Schiele writes this beautiful essay, Unser Café, Our Café, about Café des Westens, where she says, how could he close this place? How could he? And basically what he did, the owner of the place, he wanted to get rid of all these writers and all these poets and all these bohemians because he didn't make enough money.
Right. You order a cup of coffee and sit there for 5 hours.
Right,
yeah.
Right. So he wanted to reopen it. He closed it for renovation. Basically, that was an excuse to get rid of all the writers, all the artists, and all that. And he wanted to reopen it as a more bourgeois institution that will make more money. But he failed. He never really succeeded. And Elsa Lasker Schiele really wrote something partly tongue-in-cheek and kind of realizing how ridiculous it is, but partly very serious about what made Café des Westens. Café des Westens was the fact that all these people who didn't have enough money, they sat there. So there's always this really interesting tension between the coffee house as a business and the coffee house as a cultural institution. The fact that when you have these well-known writers, that's sometimes something that attracts other people to the cafe, so it could be a good kind of business model.
Yeah.
And in other cases, it's just not sustainable anymore.
Yeah, it reminds me a little of that Zweig story, Buchmendel, Mendel the bibliophile, where the previous owners always just let this guy stay there. All the students and everybody else came to consult with him, and then the change in ownership, and they start renovating, and this guy is out on his ass, and his entire life falls apart. We should tackle the second half of the subtitle of your book. It's How Cafes Created Modern Jewish Culture, which raises my question. How do you characterize modern Jewish culture?
That's a very good question. It's not easy to characterize it, and many people tried, and there isn't a clear answer. Many people say that the difference between old Jewish culture, traditional Jewish culture, is basically secularization. The fact that, Jewish culture used to be religious culture, and
now
then
it's a
at some
cultural
point
one.
in the I don't know, around the 18th century, or the beginning of the Enlightenment, and then in the 19th century with secularization. The problem is, it's true to some degree, but it's not accurate, because religion continues to play a role in modern Jewish culture. And
I will note that we're recording on Shabbat, but we're both cool with that, right?
Yeah, actually, one of the claims, one of the important claims that I make in the book, in the context of the importance of coffee houses in modern Jewish culture, is that for a lot of people it was a substitute for the synagogue. Yeah. So, we are doing exactly that.
The secular minion. We can get those
instead
guys.
Instead of going to the synagogue or the house of study, we're sitting here and drinking coffee, which is really, for many people, especially those who had traditional Jewish education, which is, I think, the majority of people here, that I write about in the book, they really experienced it as a substitute. So that would be one answer to the question: what is modern Jewish culture? But modern Jewish culture is really difficult to define. There is some scholars are saying it sounds like nonsense, but some people say what characterized modern Jewish culture is exactly the question what it is. Because before, there was no question. It was clear what it is. And then it's part of modernity that people can define themselves as Jewish and be defined by Jewish and create and write novels and poems, and which are part of world culture, and yet it is Jewish. That's kind of one answer to the question. I think the other part that I believe is central to Jewish culture is that it has something to do with tradition, and that doesn't mean, and the tradition is religious, although religiosity itself is not, I think, so important, but the text and the textual element, the text themselves, whether it's Hebrew or Yiddish, and the knowledge of the text, and the kind of struggle with the question of tradition and with the question of Jewishness. That's what makes modern Jewish culture. But I think the kind of the place where the institution of the coffee house and the question of what is modern Jewish culture intersect is really around. I spent quite a lot of time thinking about and writing about in what sense we can talk about the coffee house as a Jewish space.
Sure.
Right. So, if we look at the synagogue, if we look at the house of study, even if we look at in the American context, the JCC, even if we talk about food and drinks, the Jewish deli, right? It's clear that it's Jewish. We can say what is Jewish about it. When it comes to the coffee house, there's nothing inherent about the space itself, about the architecture, about the food, it's not. And in all the cities that I write about, it was never exclusively Jewish. Even in terms of the people who were there, it was never exclusively Jewish. Even in the Lower East Side, and even in Tel Aviv, it was never exclusively Jewish. It was always a place of mixture between Jews and non-Jews. It was always a place of mixture between different languages. The multilingualism of the cafe is very, very important. That kind of goes back to what we were talking about before, how in some places there was a lot of pressure from the local, national culture to have monolingualism, whether it's the case of Tel Aviv with Hebrew, or of course Berlin and Vienna with German culture, Kultur, and we can only be in German, but these immigrants came and brought Yiddish with them, and then Hebrew, and then so it was always and I think that's also part of the answer of what makes modern Jewish culture modern. It is multilingual, and modern Jewish literature is always multilingual. It is in Jewish languages and in non-Jewish languages, and it's important. It's impossible to kind of say, this is Jewish and this is not Jewish. So,
which again I think helps define Jewish culture, that sense of fragmentation and that polyglot nature, but also makes it difficult to characterize particularly. There's one cartoon you include in there, I forget which city it's in, but the idea that somebody orders a coffee in the native language of the city, everybody's fainting away because they've never heard.
Right. That's in Tel Aviv.
Was it I thought it was from the last chapter. I couldn't recall.
Yeah, that's in Tel Aviv, because in Tel Aviv, really, the coffee houses were a problem. I mean, Tel Aviv was a place. Everybody now knows how. Tel Aviv was the first Hebrew city and kind of the miracle of the revival of Hebrew. But in the period that I write about, which is mostly the early part of the 20th century, I mean, Tel Aviv was not established until 1908, and it was a new city. And when coffee houses, first of all, people at the beginning didn't think that there should be coffee houses. They thought it should be different from what's going on in Europe. But then very quickly,
Zionist utopianism sort of had its impression.
Yeah, but then the idea of creating Hebrew culture, there was a lot of pressure and a lot of insecurity about it, because the people who were very zealous about speak only Hebrew, they themselves were multilingual, and they wanted to create something new, and they knew that very quickly it could go. And actually, coffee houses were places where this kind of because these places were always multilingual, people recognized in Tel Aviv that this is a place, this is what they really need to fight. So they actually would put signs saying Hebrew speak Hebrew. They wouldn't say Jews or people, they would say Hebrews, because that was kind of the new Hebrew men speak Hebrew. And then there's all these cartoons about how people read newspapers in all the different languages, and then when somebody orders in Hebrew, wow, somebody faints because everybody else is doing it in German and Yiddish and Polish and Russian and English and all the other languages.
How intense was the research for this? How much did you have to rely on the fiction writers who you cite, as well as the newspaper guys, as well as sort of primary texts and what went into researching, I guess, for some of these cities that did a very good job trying to erase their Jewish history previously.
Yeah. So I mean, there was a lot of research that went into this book. Some of it was really looking at newspapers were very, very important source to find materials, because I mean, like I said earlier, the print culture, the newspapers and the coffee houses really came into being and together, and that's true maybe to some sense until today. Newspapers love to write about what's going on in the coffee houses, who was there, so newspapers were important sources. As you said, the writers themselves wrote about these places in the poems and in the stories and in the feuilletons, which is this genre that is kind of between literature and the newspapers. It's something in the newspaper. Many writers, Jewish writers and politicians, wrote in it. But there was also archival materials, letters, memoirs that people wrote. When writers wrote about these places, sometimes they would write about the coffee houses using the name of the coffee house, and that was clear what it is. But very often they wouldn't. They would
try to figure out which one they were referring to.
They were using fictional names. They were using kind of generic names. They were just talking about the coffee house in general. So I had to do a little bit of detective work, and the more I knew about the people themselves and where they lived and which cafes they went, which I found from letters or from newspapers or from other descriptions, I would know, okay, so it's clear that Shalom Aleichem is not a good example, but Agnon would write about a Berlin cafe. He wouldn't write which one it is, or Yiddish writers in New York. Sometimes they would just make up a name or write about but knowing who these people, where they lived and which cafes they went, and this was kind of a detective work. And the truth is that it was interesting because for me and for many other scholars, there's research. First you do research, you gather all the materials, and then when you feel like you have enough, you did enough research, you have all the sources, you can write. In my case, it was in the middle of writing the book. Suddenly I would go back and look for some materials, or sometimes I would just try to verify something or make sure that and then I would find a whole new world. And the more you know, the more you can make connections.
Yeah, how much did the thesis evolve as you were pursuing first those newspaper items about it and then turning it into a book? Was there a point of, how much did it change from what you thought it was going to be?
It changed a lot. I mean, I didn't really, there was maybe a kind of certain intuition or something very basic about the importance of the coffee house and the fact that so many people wrote about it. That was there maybe from the very beginning, but kind of the thesis of what the book is about, and also the important themes that emerged again and again in all the different chapters and all the different cities. That's not something that was clear to me from the very beginning. For example, how central the element of gender is. Both what we already mentioned, the fact that it was mostly male space, what I call homosocial space, and it was a kind of substitute for the house of study and that's not something that I kind of started with. It wasn't clear to me. I kind of noticed that it was mostly men and very few women, but then I didn't really know and put kind of together those specific women who were exceptional. But because they were part of cafe culture and because they wrote about it quite a lot, they became also very central, very significant in my book. That's just one example. Also, when I start and when I finish the book, the point of beginning and the point of end wasn't clear to me at all. Kind of knew from writing my previous book and the research that I started doing that the first half of the 20th century, really from the beginning of the 20th century until World War II, I knew that that's the center. But how far would it go back? I'd never imagined even when I wrote it, that in the process of writing the first few chapters, that I'm going to start the Berlin chapter with Moses Mendelssohn, the father of the Jewish Enlightenment. Because what do I know about Mendelssohn? I don't know a lot about the 18th century and this period. And I always thought that Berlin cafe culture and the importance of Jews really started at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century. But I would go and check, and then I found that Heinrich Heine at the beginning of the 19th century, that was actually very important. Wow, so okay. And then, wait a second, what about the early period? And then when I found, it's not that I was the one who discovered it. Other people wrote everything that I think that is possible about Moses Mendelssohn, because he was such an important figure in Jewish history and in world history and in philosophy and all that. But I think I'm the first one who really made the connection between the fact that he really kind of started, he made his breakthrough in this learned coffee house. For other people, just kind of noticed it on the way, kind of the biography, on the way to do more important things. But when I looked at it and when I saw what kind of things he was writing when he went to the coffee house, I think I noticed things that nobody else did, which is that he wrote this kind of moral weekly, something that resembles what the London Spectator was in German. He wrote it in pseudonym, and then he wrote Hebrew. one. And this is actually the first Hebrew newspaper in the world, the modern, which Moses Mendelssohn wrote also without signing his name, but we know it was him.
Yeah.
So that's another example of something that I had no idea of when I started the book and thinking about the thesis and when it starts and when it ends. I didn't really know. And you know, the question of when to end it, when it's in Europe, it's kind of clear. That
there's a terminal point for us in Europe.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. There's a terminal point. I mean, it's not that there was no after World War II kind of people went back to Berlin and to Vienna and to Warsaw, but you know, robust Jewish culture and the presence of Jews as important people, as important in the cities, really very clearly ended with World War II. But then when I wrote about New York and Tel Aviv, when to finish it, it was. I guess it still is an open question. I had to make a decision, and I think I stand by it, but it's not so clear cut.
Because you're writing about Jewish history and cultural history, and all of those are ambiguous terms as they go. But I thought it was interesting the way New York extends into the 50s and beyond, and then Tel Aviv grows even further as the final two chapters of the book. You know, again, there's a sort of looking back at Europe, but a sense that, you know, again, you're in a new land, you're in a new city now. Did you think it was going to take this long? You mentioned 10 years. I know it wasn't 10 continuous years.
No, it wasn't 10 continuous years.
I
didn't think it's going to be that long. But no, writing books like this always take more time than you think, and it is kind of the nature of writing it and doing the research. And I mean, in a way, it's I'm privileged to be. You know, to be working at the university and to do research and to work on a number of projects at the same time and to take the time that is needed to write such a book. I mean, one could write such a book in a hurry and it would be fine, but I think doing the deep research, it was for me also a journey, because it's not... This topic and this book took me to places that I never imagined I'm going to go metaphorically and physically, and to write about. So, you know, I mean, many scholars feel very uncomfortable writing, not writing about something that an area that they know very, very well. And I think from the very beginning it became clear to me that this book, the topic, because it's kind of lends to so many things, it's going to take me to many places, including places where it's not my immediate area of expertise, but you know, it was even an opportunity for me to learn a lot of things, and I enjoyed the ride very much.
As far as the geographic part goes, favorite city you travel to for this?
It's a good question. I don't think I have a favorite one.
Most surprising?
I don't think I have a favorite one. I loved visiting all of them, and I loved. I mean, of course, some cities like Tel Aviv I know very well.
Right. So.
I was born and grew up not far from Tel Aviv. I know Tel Aviv very well. Other cities I just got to know. Some cities like Odessa and Warsaw I really visited just because of the book and because of the work that I'm doing. But you know, it doesn't matter whether it's cities that I knew well or spent a lot of time, or cities that I only went for a visit of a week or so. When I was focused on this project and on this book, I found it really fascinating to walk in the streets of Odessa, Warsaw, Vienna, or Berlin, or even New York, the Lower East Side, and to see what's going on there now. but in my head, in my imagination,
you got that
I've got this kind of virtual. I mean, I was so immersed in it because of the research that I did, that it kind of like, sometimes I would walk in the streets of Berlin or Odessa and stop paying attention because I was so immersed in where I am. Where was this house? Where was this coffee house? How far was it for Sholem Aleichem to walk to Cafe Fanconi? Like I just wanted to understand it. Did he go to the local place? Did he go to a specific place in the center of the city and all that? So I was so focused on that I kind of forgot that and then immediately it's kind of all these elements of what actually exists there now, which was so fascinating. So I really enjoyed visiting all these cities, and I don't think I have a favorite. I really love thinking and writing and learning about all these different cities.
Anywhere you felt uncomfortable as a Jew?
No.
Okay.
No.
I know you're not walking around with a kippah on or anything, but still.
Yeah. I mean, let me tell you. I mean, this is. I visited Warsaw many years ago, before walking on this, and there I didn't feel comfortable.
Yeah.
I mean, partly it's part of it is the fact that it's family connection.
Same. That's what I'm sort of wondering about, the comfort level with some countries.
My grandmother is from Warsaw, and she left Warsaw just a few years before the war. She read a poem about Tel Aviv in Yiddish. That's what she told me just before she died. And she thought,
this is the place for me?
So beautiful, I want to go and visit there. And it's a long story. I don't know, maybe later we'll have time to talk about it and I'll tell you the full story. But her father didn't want her to go. She belonged to a Hasidic community. And she decided that she's going to go anyway. And going back to Warsaw, I went there when it was still just after the Soviet. It was still a Soviet city, and it was depressing because I knew that there was so much Jewish life. I knew that my family came from there, and yet everything that I saw was either the cemetery or the monument for the Holocaust, and that's it. Now, 3 years ago, when I went again, because of the book and because everything changed, suddenly the city itself is bustling, it's beautiful, there's beautiful coffee houses there, there's a huge museum of Polin, the museum for Jews in Poland, and a lot of people, specifically in Warsaw, I don't know how true it is for other places in Poland, are very, very interested in Jewish culture. People study Hebrew and Yiddish, and so these two visits were like night and day. But going to Odessa, I was afraid of, because it's Ukraine. I mean, it was before the problems in the last few years. I was there 6-7 years ago. But I don't know. Have you been to Odessa?
No, part of my family history is Ukraine. I'm first generation American, so I've got some history too. It's in Ukraine, and I actually went to Kiev, and I went to Odessa, and I also went to Lvov, Lemberg, which I write about a little bit in the book. That's, by the way, another city that I thought originally could have been the next year,
a chapter, but it was too much. But Odessa is a very unique place. It's a very unique place because it is in Ukraine, but even until today, it's more Russian than Ukrainian. It has people visiting from all over the world. It's a port city, and they love the history so much. You don't even need a guide or a book. In other places I wanted a local person who knows the places and will help me. This I didn't even need it. You just walk in the streets and you have multiple plaques for Sholem Aleichem. There's a plaque in Russian, there's a plaque in Hebrew, there's a plaque in Yiddish, and Babel. There's a whole square around Isaac Babel. So Odessa is a city that really loves and cherishes its cultural history and its literature. They take it very, very seriously in a way that other cities. So of course, I mean, if you go to Berlin, of course, there's a lot of monuments and for German writers, but almost nothing about the writers that I'm interested in, and but there you walk in the streets, and in certain places they have these plaques. Have you been to Berlin?
I'm going to next fall. I've got a trade show in Frankfurt, so I'm tying that into a get over to Berlin and finally see that city.
So Berlin actually tries to, especially around the Holocaust, try to really take. So there's little like squares on the streets marking specific houses where. So I mean, I would walk around the streets of Berlin. I've been to Berlin a few times, and again immersed in my own research to try to find it. And then you walk, and literally you walk on the streets. You have these squares with. So it doesn't really. I mean, it's kind of haunting experience. It doesn't let you forget it at all. The painful history and what's going on. At the same time, it's nowadays it's bustling, and there's a lot of Jewish culture in Berlin, which a few years ago it was people from the former Soviet Union. Now there's a whole Israeli community in there. People moved away from Israel for economic reasons, and some of the activities actually happening in coffee houses where people meet Arab writers and people from the Middle East. So it's fascinating what's going on now in these places.
We talk about migration. Mm-hmm. You're a professor in Ann Arbor, Michigan.
Right.
What took you from Israel to America?
Oh, well, that's the academic world and the difficulty in finding academic positions now anywhere in the world. But
sure.
I said I'm from Netanya, which is just north of Tel Aviv.
I'm sure our families know each other. So most of my family is in Israel. I've got almost
really?
no one in North America. But yeah.
So and I studied for my BA and MA at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, which was a wonderful place at the time. But after being there for a few years, when I decided that I'm going to do a PhD, I went to Berkeley, California, and that was a great experience. It really opened my mind. I studied with people like Robert Alter, Hannah Kronfeld, Nomi Zeidman. There was a center there that was very, very unique. And after that, I spent a year at Harvard, and then I went back to Israel. I taught at Ben Gurion University in the Negev. Then I got a job offer in Ann Arbor, Michigan, at University of Michigan. I thought it's going to be a good place for me for a couple of years, and then either I'm going to go back to Israel or even maybe in the United States, in California or in the East Coast. And that's kind of migration of I'm not sure if it's kind of the new kind of cycle of Jewish migrations, where many, or it's I think it's both bad, the fact that you have people from Israel, from the former Soviet Union, who are moving, but also it's something that is, I think, kind of unique to the academic.
There's always very specific reasons to.
Where if you do a PhD and if you're crazy enough to do a PhD, now I say it in a real kind of. Things changed even between the time that I finished. I'm not that old, but between the time I finished and now, you really need to be crazy to do it and kind of to love it to the degree that you think, my life is not gonna be full unless I do it. But and then when you do it, I shouldn't speak for other people, but for me,
for your own craziness,
my own craziness, it became really my identity, became who I am. So I was ready, and I was lucky that my wife and kids, they were very small, were able to move with me, and we didn't know how long it's going to last, but I'm very happy now with being in Ann Arbor, apart from the fact that it's not a big city.
So. Oh, I thought you were going to say the fact that it has winter.
Yeah, well,
because
that's
Berkeley does get a little cold, but not.
The winter is a sore point. That's something that I'm never going to get used to. I always tell people the only thing I like about the winter in Michigan is putting the fireplace on and sit and read a book.
With a book. That's
but also the fact that I love. I mean, so much of this project and this book, as much as it is about coffee houses, it's about cities and the big city and I love big cities. So I come to New York, I go to Chicago, I go to Berlin, I go to Tel Aviv and that's kind of our life. Our life now. I mean, these people also were traveling all the time, but for them to travel from America to Berlin or to Tel Aviv would take weeks and weeks, and we can do it relatively fast and so our life right now very, very different. And some of my friends take it even further and say that they can live in New York and feel like they are fully in Israel and in Israeli culture just because of the internet and communication and media and everything that is so I don't know what I feel about that. That's actually, I mean, the whole question of
which we should get to. The conclusion of the book is sort of about the decline of coffee houses and whether virtual communities help replace that.
Right.
We should talk about that. 'Cause my take on it, and I talked about this with Moby back in August in one of my weirdest podcasts ever. For me, one of the exemplars of that in our time is record stores. There are no record stores anymore.
Right.
Where do those kids?
But
really, and New York City, etc. But we're talking suburban world. You used to have Tower Records, you had all these places. Where do the kids who used to hang out in record stores physically go? And movie rentals are the same thing. You get Quentin Tarantino working in a video store, developing his aesthetic that he would then turn into a movie making career. If that physical outlet no longer exists, much like the question with the coffee houses, what supplants that? So, what supplants that?
Yeah, so I'm glad you're asking me this. I'm glad that you are making the comparison between record stores and maybe even bookstores, and because
those are also in significant decline, and that's also a place where people would hang. Although bookstores, I don't know if people converse with each other as much.
No, but with the coffee house, there's a paradox because on one hand, to say that coffee houses don't exist anymore, it's the opposite. There's more coffee houses today than there ever been, and each one of these cities that I write about, there are, if you look just at the numbers, I don't know, maybe Vienna, they claim that there used to be 1,000 coffee houses in 1900, and maybe today there's less, but I think in every other city there's more coffee houses today or coffee shops, or I don't know what to call them, but so there's a certain paradox there, and there's a real question. I mean, it's not that these institutions are gone. People love to drink coffee, and there are places where we are sitting now in one of them, and around us there are so many of them, and yet something is different, and it's very difficult to put your finger and to say what is different about it. Specifically in the context of my book, I think it's very easy to say, although many people argue with me and disagree with me, that this kind of convergence of the creation of modern Jewish culture and coffee houses, that's something that doesn't exist anymore. I can't really think of any coffee house in any of these cities where you can say, okay, the most important writers, the most significant literary and cultural activities really happening around these coffee houses. And why that's the case, why these places were for many years productive for modern Jewish culture and now not. There are many different answers to these questions, and I really wanted to end my book consciously with questions. And I give my own answer, but I leave it open for other people to give their own answer. So I think the answer is complex. I mean, part of it is how the function of coffee houses in general changed. I mean, we have We have today, of course, all the chains, places like Starbucks, and the fact that even when people like myself go to coffee houses, now we're sitting and talking, but most of the time when I go to the coffee house, I go with my laptop.
It's just people looking at a screen.
I'm looking at the screen, right? I mean, I could have done it at home. I like doing it in a coffee house, but that's very, very different from the kind of activity that happened in the early period. So it's very clear that it changed, and actually the fact that the internet and social media and the virtual spaces, something that replaced it. I really have to say I owe this insight mostly to my students, because I decided 3-4 years ago to take the topic of the book and offer it as an undergraduate course, as a kind of alternative introduction to modern Jewish culture.
Yeah.
And students loved it, and I would love to ask the students who are younger than me, much younger than me, what they think about this question. Do they know any of the places where they could say this kind of... And immediately they said, "Oh no, today it's
I'm in my dorm room. I'm on my phone."
Okay, of course, it's because all of that is happening online, on social media and Facebook and Twitter and Snapchat and all that. And then when I started to read a little bit, I don't know much about kind of contemporary, digital culture, but I did remember that in the early days of the internet, there were all these, people would call these early places where people would gather around the world virtually, they called them cafes. Yeah. And that makes a lot of sense, right? Because people kind of still remembered it and still connected it with it. And I don't know where things are going to go. I mean, I had a conversation recently with somebody who said, you're kind of old-fashioned, you're nostalgic about these places and all that. First of all, maybe there are some places, I mean, it's possible that it's going to change and coffee houses again are going to emerge as maybe Dafka, because of the alienation of the digital, people are going to yearn more for the physical place. There's also this kind of communities of people around the world and around the country that are created online. But then, once they know each other, they want to
meet in person,
and they make sure that they create this kind of hybrid community where part of it is happening online, virtual, part of it is happening in a coffee house or so we never know where things are going to go. But the other answer to the question that I stress, and I try not to be too nostalgic about it. I mean, part of it is inevitable, but I mean, a lot of what the book is about, as we mentioned before, it's about migration, it's about people being forced to move. Also, in the coffee house itself, it's not just about this great activity.
Yeah, it wasn't a Camelot or anything.
There were very strong tensions around class and gender and about anti-Semitism, and the fact that these places became identified with Jewishness and became kind of Jewish spaces attracted a lot of anti-Semitism and a lot of pushback of people who said, we Polish culture, German culture, Austrian culture, not these Jews who sit in coffee houses and right. So I think really that's another part of it, and that's kind of the not so great element and not so happy element of that. The coffee houses were very often refuge for people in a time of migration, in a time of people who were forced to move from one place to another, and although today there still is migration, like I moved from Israel to the United States, but the kind of this phenomenon of Jewish migration, a period of migration and urbanization, that doesn't exist anymore. I think that also goes to explain why coffee houses today don't function in such a way. They don't fulfill this role. People typically would have their own places. They have houses, and so that's another element. But it really is an open question, and the end of the book is exactly about this is about all these attempts to recreate something or to retrieve it and how it's impossible. I mean, there is this novel about a couple who opened, which is based on a real something that really happened.
Yeah.
To recreate a Viennese cafe in the Lower East Side, or an Israeli woman whose family came from Berlin and made a documentary called Cafe Nagler about stories that she heard from her family who owned this house, and then when she goes back, not just that the place doesn't exist anymore, which is not so surprising, but also when she talks to people, she hears from them that actually this place was not at all an important place, or this was all part of the stories, and which kind of goes back to something that we didn't speak about so much, on how we spoke a lot about the coffee house as a physical space and the kind of the cultural activity and what people are doing in it, but it's also the especially in terms of people writing about it and thinking about it. I use this concept comes from cultural geography of third space, of something that is between the real and the imaginary and the private and the public, and so much of much of the reason why these places were so productive, and also why people wrote about them, was that it was a mix between the reality and the imagination, the experiential element of the place. I mean, I was always amazed to see, you asked before about research, how, let's say, in Berlin, in Romanisches Cafe, which was a huge place, and you read about it in German sources, and they talk about it as an important place, and as a place that is very typical of the Weimar period, but they don't mention Jews at all. Then you read something that is written in Hebrew or in Yiddish from a Jewish point of view, and you get the impression that the place was
wall to wall.
Wall to wall. There was a Zionist table, there was a Bundist table, there was a socialist table, and so what's correct? What's the real? What's the reality? Once you have, and then when you read also the poems and the novels and the stories and the memoirs as well, you really get a sense that it is this kind of interaction between the reality, which is the architecture of the place, the food and the drink and the people who were there, and the experiential, how people experienced it. That's what made it.
And at no point were you tempted to follow Michael Edov's example and try to open your own. Okay, I'm just making sure. I assume Ann Arbor in particular.
Yeah. Actually, my wife is a caterer. She's a chef.
Yeah.
And
she would have beaten that idea out of you pretty severely? Or?
Well, I mean, yeah. I mean, she at some point thought about opening, but she has a catering business. And it's funny because a few years ago, we were talking and just kind of dreaming, as people dream often, like. That's actually not in the book because I didn't write about Prague, but it's very famous that Kafka, a year or two before he died, he wrote to his lover letters, and he would dream about immigrating to Tel Aviv and opening a cafe, and he would be a waiter there, right? So I remember a couple of years ago, maybe more, telling my wife, maybe when I retire from teaching, maybe I'll open a place where we roast coffee and sell. Yeah. And she's like, "What are you talking about?" This is exactly.
I say anybody with experience in this world at all would beat that idea out of you. Yeah. I will point out when we talk about that sense of the virtual and the physical. There's a reason you and I are sitting here in person. I always get asked by guests like yourself who are not in the New York, New Jersey area, can we do this by Skype? Mm-hmm. Or can you do this by video? No. This is, to me, it's very important that two people be sitting at a table. For the listener, it's still a virtual experience, but there, to me, still has to be that sense of two people not looking at screens for an hour or so, which I find kind of important.
Yeah, no, I really feel it, and the interaction and the kind of the level of the conversation and the connection it makes a big difference between, when I spoke to people who interviewed me and asked me questions for newspaper or for other podcasts, then we would be in very, very different places, and I would be on my own, and it's difficult to...
I always figure the other person's probably going to spend their time goofing around on the internet instead of, this way at least I know you're looking at me, so we can pretend we're paying attention.
Right.
Your literary background, where did that begin for you? What was were there particular texts and novelists who started you on this path? Not for the book itself, but your academic and beyond.
I understand. Actually, my path to literary studies was very unusual. I grew up. I spoke a little bit about how where I was born and grew up in Netanya, but I grew up in an Orthodox family, and I studied. It wasn't ultra-Orthodox, but it was kind of modern Orthodox, Zionist Orthodox, in the Israeli sense, which actually is almost...
Very, very different than American.
But it's also changed so much in Israel. You asked before about what changed in Israel. That's one thing that changed in Israel, because my parents were not settlers, and there was this kind of religious Zionist, but very kind of open to culture, to music, to that's my parents. Actually, my father passed away a few weeks ago.
Oh, I'm sorry.
And I remember how much he loved classical music and going to concerts and stuff like that. But I was part of a generation where it would be typical for my generation to be more strict than our parents. So when I went to high school, I went to yeshiva high school. There was a boarding school, so I wasn't at home. I was with them, and we didn't study literature. We studied literature maybe for a year or two, and it was very kind of superficial. And then I would study Talmud and Jewish thought instead of literature. That fact actually taught me, I'm very convinced, to know how to read. Close reading is very, very, very strong, and something that I very much appreciate and take it with me. Of course, it was close reading of Talmud and Midrash and Jewish texts.
But it's still that process of reading.
Yeah. And then anyway, it's a long story. I'm not going to get into how I left this world.
You could say corrupted, but whatever. That's fine. Seduced by literature.
I was seduced by literature. That sounds very good and romantic. But I did have a thirst for literature, because it's not something that, many people I talk to, they say, you study literature, like we studied literature in high school, and it's really ruined for me, kind of, that would be a typical an experience for a lot of people, where they would hate kind of analysis and doing just read for the pleasure of it. But in my case, I think there was just thirst. Actually, as a child, as a small child, I would read all the time. I would go to library, and I remember coming back from the library, just walking. It was only 10 minutes, but walking, reading the books, and
smacking into the wall.
So that was when I was very little. I loved reading from the very beginning, and then when I was in high school, I kind of stopped reading because I didn't have time, and we didn't study literature, and I didn't have the kind of nobody introduced me to any poetry and novels, and for adulthood, and I discovered it on my own, and I really had this thirst for literature. So when I was 17, 18, I would start to read like crazy. And actually, when I was in the Israeli army, because everybody in Israel has to go to the army, and I was lucky to be in a place that actually I did mostly intellectual work, and I had a little bit of time to read a lot, and I took some courses at the Open University, which I could take as a soldier, and there was a course on on modernism, but not in the Jewish context.
Yeah.
On world modernism, I would read Kafka, and I would read Albert Camus, and I would read Joseph Conrad, and I would read, and that was a kind of formative experience. And and initially when I went to university, I thought I'm going to study. I mean, I enrolled in studying kind of international studies. I thought maybe I want to be a diploma or something practical, and then like literature.
The most unpractical, but
yeah. But then very quickly I saw that I really love it, and I left international studies, and I was part of I was invited to join this kind of honors program at the Hebrew University, where at that time the Hebrew University was really amazing. It still had these European professors who would come so I loved literature. I loved also the academic world and academic work from early on. And then, every time I would study with some of these professors, open my mind to another world, and then in Berkeley. So it was a kind of slow process, and not a typical one. But I don't know what is the typical one exactly.
More coffee would have made it go by faster.
Yeah.
I'm just kidding. Shachar, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thank you. It was a pleasure. I really enjoyed it.
And that was Shachar Pinsker. I enjoyed A Rich Brew an awful lot, but like I said, the intersection of coffee and Jews is right up my alley, and I'm sort of guessing it's a pretty good Venn diagram with a bunch of my listeners. A Rich Brew is published by NYU Press, and you can get it in better bookstores. And it really is illuminating in terms of exploring that matrix of migration, secular Jewish culture, the nodes of connection that bring cultural figures together. I learned a ton from it, and I recommend it pretty highly. Shachar doesn't have a website of his own, but he does have a Twitter feed that he's relatively active on, and that's Spinsker, or S. Pinsker, Spinsker. If you go to his profile page there, it's got a link to his faculty page at University of Michigan. And after we wrapped, I asked Shachar, so, who you reading? If you want to hear his answer to that, you'll need to become a supporter of the Virtual Memories Show so you can get access to our quarterly bonus podcast, Fear of a Square Planet. The third quarter episode features book recommendations and some extra conversation with Moby, Audrey Niffenegger, Mark Ulrichsen, David Lloyd, Glenn David Gold, Ken Crimstein, Hal Mayforth, Lance Richardson, and Nathaniel Popkin. You can support the Virtual Memories Show via patreon.com/VMSpod or paypal.me/VMSpod. I've got all sorts of goals and goodies in place for patrons, including that podcast, patron-only blog, handwritten show notes for every episode, my secret project, and more. So go to patreon.com/VMSpod and support the art of fine conversation. Now, I recorded this episode at the restaurant connected to Hotel Henri on West 24th Street in New York City. So that means $12 or so at the George Washington Bridge, $30 or so to park, and $6 for the subway trip. Shachar paid for the coffee. Now, if you want to help defray some of the costs of the Virtual Memories Show, like web hosting, travel, equipment, coffee, or just toss me some money because you think the show is worth it, then visit patreon.com/VMSpod or paypal.me/VMSpod and make a one-time or recurring donation. A special thanks go out to Joe Caruso, Michael Hacker, Michael Janizik, Paul Karasik, Fred Kish, Jonathan Kranz, Jack Lescamella, Teresa Lewis, Stephen Nadler, Payne Prophet, Dmitry Samarov, Stephen Solomon, Craig P. Steffen, Greg Tanner, Ford Thomas, Noah Van Sciver, and Garrett Zecker for going over and above in their support of the Virtual Memories Show. We have the full list of show supporters at chimeraobscura.com/VM. Our music for this episode is Fella by Hal Mayforth, used with permission from the artist. Hal's a recent guest of the show, so go into the archives and you can find that and a link to his SoundCloud page where there's a lot more of his music. And that's it for this week's episode of the Virtual Memories Show. Thanks so much for listening. We'll be back next week with Summer Pierre, author of the new graphic memoir, All the Sad Songs, unless I die when I'm running this 5K on Sunday. That probably won't happen, so don't worry. Now you can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show and download past episodes at the iTunes Store. You can also find all our episodes and get on our email list at either of our websites, vmspod.com or chimeraobscura.com/VM. You can also follow the Virtual Memories Show on Twitter and Instagram at vmspod, at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com, and on YouTube, Spotify, and TuneIn.com by searching for Virtual Memories Show. And if you like this podcast, please go to the iTunes Store, look up the Virtual Memories Show, and leave a rating and maybe a review for us. That'll help us build a bigger audience. Now, you've been listening to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth, and you are awesome. Keep it that way.